Hi, welcome to episode 28 of the podcast Peace Matters. Today's topic is Voices of Dissent, Unpacking the Protests Shaping Serbia's Future. I am Stefanie Fenkert and my guests are Lura Pollozhani and Ivan Vejvoda. Ivan Vejvoda is a permanent fellow of the Institute for Human Sciences, and he also used to be a political advisor of the former Prime Minister of Serbia, Zoran Đinđić. Lura Pollozhani, she is a researcher at the University of Graz, and she herself was also an advisor to a Prime Minister, but of North Macedonia, Zoran Zaev. I hope you find this discussion interesting. Please like and subscribe. Ivan and Lura, thank you very much for joining me today to discuss something which I think is quite extraordinary happening right now in our neighboring region, especially in the so-called Western Balkan, Southeast European countries, and in Serbia. We are witnessing right now student protests, which are, I would say, extraordinary in the scale, but also in the support they are having from universities. The background of it is started, interestingly, in Novi Sad. There was this tragedy when this train station broke down and 15 people died. But maybe I would start with you, Ivan. Maybe you can just give us a little bit of a background. What happened and why did the people rise? What do they want? What is happening right now in Serbia?
Well, thank you for the invitation, Stephanie. Indeed, this was very unexpected from a generation of students whom we all thought were, Gen Z, apolitical, apathetic, on TikTok, waiting to get a diploma and leave the country to find better jobs. And the fact that they rose, triggered by this tragedy, as you mentioned, of 15 people killed, was, in fact, I would say, the result of 12 years of authoritarian rule, of a corrupt system. And, there's corruption in all of our societies to various degrees. And you can live with it as long as there aren't tragedies. And if you repair a square in a city and the cobblestones are a bit uneven, maybe you trip or something. And so after 12 years of living like this, suddenly you have 15 innocent people dying, and there's an explosion because of the accumulated anger and frustration of things not being right, in addition to captured state, captured institutions, completely the judiciary, the prosecution, no separation of powers anymore, no checks and balances. And this generation explodes in the most positive way in demanding rule of law, in demanding institutions. They're not even addressing the president. They're saying, no, it's not about you. This is about the fact that we want to come back to a somewhat normal society where laws and institutions govern, not one person. And in fact, the student upheaval, which is fantastic in so many ways. Their emotions, they're eloquent, they're so well organized. It's all of the universities in Serbia, it's most of the professors, it's high schools, it's elementary schools now, it's trade unions, it's lawyers on strike, and they're going on these marches, and every city in Serbia, every smallest town, about 200 have been touched by a variety of demonstrations. The question, and we'll probably come back to that, how does that translate then into politics? And does that lead to a change of regime? In what way and in what direction? But what I've been saying is two things. One is this is a sort of cleansing of society. It's a purgatory. And secondly, let's frankly enjoy the positive moment, because we see that Serbia is a healthy society and it has a great future through these young people, I repeat, who have decided to stay in the country and make a better life here rather than all leaving.
Thank you, Ivan. Lura, what you just heard, you have been researching civic movements for a very long time already, and you have been following the events in Serbia and in the region, I know, for a couple of years already. And interestingly, this is not the first movement, when people in Serbia got onto the streets. We remember a couple of years ago when there was this gun violence, when also these protests erupted. But they have not been, I would say, quite as successful, although we don't know yet what that means, but that continuity which you have been describing, and especially also the support of the universities, and also that it's all over the country, so it's not only a Belgrade thing. So how would you assess the situation there, and what is your hope maybe, and what is maybe also the biggest challenge they are facing today, the protesters?
Well, I agree with Ivan in the sense that we really do need to seize this hopeful moment and look at it as a cleansing and look at it in a bigger context where, and maybe inspire ourselves to also be more critical and more, let's say, active in pursuing more just and fair societies. I think I truly agree that what the students are doing in Serbia is remarkable, because let's just consider the context. Most of these students have seen the face of Vučić in power for all of their adult life, and most likely also their childhood. So this is a person who's been in power, who their parents, their neighbors, their associates have voted for, who have been affected, their daily lives have been affected by this regime. So the fact that these students are putting a very critical turn on the regime is very impactful, because it means, as you said, that this is a healthy, in a way, democratic spirit that they're embodying. And not only are they embodying it with their statements, they're also doing it with the actions that they've chosen. For example, some might see it as whimsical that they're using humor and dance and all of these ways of expressing their discontent that are perhaps not too serious, but challenging a regime that is authoritarian, increasingly authoritarian, with humor is perhaps the smartest thing you can do, because you're saying, you don't have the power to scare me. I can make fun of you. And I've seen this also before with the Gruevski regime and the colorful revolution, how humor impacted so many of the movement participants to say, you know what, finally I can see that this regime can be challenged. And when you think a regime can be challenged, when you think power, the powers that be can be challenged, that is a very powerful emotion, that is a very powerful position for social movements, for activists, and most importantly for citizens, to see that things can be challenged. They don't have to be the way that they've been. And such regimes work on isolation. They work on this idea of, you're alone, and if you're not for us, then you're the outlier, because, they enjoy this broad support or seemingly broad support. So challenging and scratching away at this facade that these regimes build is very powerful, and the students are doing it in a genius way by using all these different methods, by using marches, by using blockades, by using also the plenums, which embody democracy in a very basic, essential way. So the fact that students meet every day in their universities, or some of the universities have different rules, also shows that, there's this desire to embody democracy from the ground up, which I think is always an essential wake-up call to any country that wants to pursue a more democratic future, let's say. And a last note on this would be that I think, because you mentioned the earlier protests, and here I think this is quite different, because not only because the protests have lasted so long, but I think the challenge to the regime is also trickier, in the sense that all these regimes, they function on this idea of fear, and the idea that we protect you from this fear and from this, whatever fear that be, whether it be another country or another community or ethnicity within the country, as many of the leaders in the region have done. But in this case, this regime has shown that it cannot protect its citizens, because citizens died at their hands. An institution that they were in charge of building collapsed. And this also is really a serious challenge to the regime that claims to be there to protect its citizens, so we must trust it because it's the only protection. Obviously, it's not the only protection. And in Macedonia, also back then, this was also the wake-up call. The idea that a regime that is built on corruption can kill. A regime can kill. It doesn't have to pull a trigger in a direct sense, but through these structures that are unjust and unfair and not checked by anybody in a fair and non-arbitrary way, it can kill you. It can seriously harm you and take away your life. And I think this is a serious challenge to the regime, and that's why this is different, I think, from all the other movements and conventions before.
Thank you, Lura. Even maybe following on also up on what Lura just said, because I think what is also very important is that it's, as you said, it's protest also with humor, so it's very non-violent, right? So, and maybe we can later also discuss a little bit, because you just came from Georgia and there are protests ongoing. They are in a very different context, but it would be nice also then to hear a little bit about how you see it there, because those are a lot more, I would say, I'm not saying violent, but, you know, the whole situation is a little on the ground, is more tense in this sense, you know, what you can feel on the streets and what we see, at least in TV. But maybe back to Serbia, because you said, and I think this is interesting, you know, that it's not against Vučić himself, you know, that they literally, it's difficult for the regime to attack the people there, because it's a very democratic movement and there is not this leadership figure, which would make it easy, I assume, for an authoritarian government to crack down on the protests. Or what would be your take? I mean, why is it so successful? And still, Vučević, I mean, he actually resigned, and I don't know if this happened in the protests before, that a high-level, at least political figure resigned, or how would you assess this resignation of Vučević? And I'm pretty sure that Aleksandar Vučić also had a say in this decision of his own resignation. But what would you say about it?
Well, first of all, on the resignation, it's a result of public pressure from below, as we said, direct pressure. First of all, Vučević, the prime minister, was the mayor of Novi Sad when the reconstruction of the railway station happened, and there was also the resignation, which is not talked about, of the current mayor of Novi Sad. So, you know, the regime is under pressure to deliver something. The key demand of the students, which is ongoing, and I don't think they will relent until that key demand is met, and that is that all the documents related to the reconstruction of the station, including the money path, the contractors, subcontractors, sub-subcontractors. The key contractor is a Chinese company, a subcontractor is a Hungarian company. The sub-subcontractors are small Serbian companies. People want to see, and the government has been under pressure to publish these thousands of pages, but it hasn't published everything, even though they maintain they have. And then suddenly a week later, we find out that they haven't. So they're basically not telling the truth, to put it politely. On the movement itself, I don't want to sound too grandiose because we're living the moment of history, but I think that one can compare, all things being equal, to the early days of the French Revolution or the Paris Commune. This is really, as Laura said, something grassroots, authentic, from below, very thought through in democratic terms, very horizontal, very organized plenums, very structured discussions, egalitarian decision-making. And they're really insisting on this, that no one sticks out. They delegate people to talk to the press or to go to various places. But I think that is the greatest worth of the thing for someone like ourselves, who are political scientists, or to see something authentic. We know these very pure things do not, unfortunately, last too long, like the Paris Commune or the French Revolution. But if I may, Stephanie, you know, Yugoslavia was the harbinger in the early 90s of nationalism and identity politics. When Europe was liberating itself from communism, 89, we were all going towards democracy, and even Russia was going to somehow become more democratic, and maybe even China. And Yugoslavia was going completely the car on the wrong way on the highway, right? And we thought we were the crazy exception. It turns out we were the announcement of what was going to happen. Maybe, and this is kind of the hopeful thing, that maybe this is an announcement of people rising to demand for their rights. I was in Georgia myself just before the elections in October with a group of our colleagues from Europe, and we saw the energy of the people who were ready to defend their rights. The situations are very different, as you mentioned, between Serbia and Georgia. But what is the same is this authentic demand for a decent society, for a society where there's basic rule of law. And I think, you know, Laura will tell us more about it, but we felt it on the streets of Tbilisi, of these people, where 85% of people want to join the European Union. Likewise here, what's interesting, and maybe this is the last thing to say, I think we have a form of constitutional patriotism here. The students do not want to feel attached to anyone. Friends ask me, you know, why are there no European flags? I said, you know, slowly goes. They feel that the key thing is that we by our own means, deliver for ourselves a decent society, and then help will come, and then joining the European Union. But especially in the world that we're in, as we see, you have to depend on yourself. And we're talking about, can Europe find the energy to help itself? I think we are seeing a basic element of that understanding that, you should always count on friends. Solidarity is a key concept that we use. But let's first try by ourselves with all the means that we have.
Thanks, Ivan. I do have maybe a follow-up question before we go to Georgia, because I really would like to speak a little bit about it as well. What was the response from the regime so far? Because we do know, one of the biggest problems, besides the authoritarian tendencies and what SNS has been doing in intimidation about citizens in the last couple of years, there is also a huge lack of free media. And the media in Serbia specifically is also very toxic, I would say. So what do you think, what role does the media play there? And what is the regime actually able to do right now? And what is it doing right now?
Well, thank you for bringing up that question, and the media in particular. Let me start with that. The regime, following various playbooks, whether it's Viktor Orban's or spin dictators or strongmen, has captured the key national frequency broadcast media. And strangely and interestingly, the president of Serbia is more or less on television every day, explaining everything from the minutest to the broadest details. He controls the tabloids, which are very cheap, and people in cafes read those. There are independent media. We do have independent media news outlets, but they are the TV channels that are independent are seen by only 33% of the population. Of course, the younger generation is on platforms and they inform themselves in these ways. But those voters who are still with the president rely on that famous 7:30 newscast by the national broadcaster, which also came under pressure and began reporting on the student protests, but then stopped again. And so, as many analysts have said, until you liberate the public broadcaster, as happened after Milosevic fell, we won't get anywhere. The response of the regime has been completely a roller coaster, from violence to totally peaceful demands for dialogue and respecting the students, going back to incidents of violence, arrest of people, then letting them go. This is the difference between a Serbia or a Turkey or a Georgia. He can't arrest people because that would be the end of it, because we are a candidate country for the European Union, and that is repeated every day by ministers. Our strategic goal is to join Europe, so you can't use techniques like Erdogan does or someone else. There is this totally untruthful narrative that this is an attempt at changing the regime by foreign outside forces. They say by outside and inside forces. Nobody really understands what they're saying. Attacks on various countries. Once it's Russia trying to change the regime, another time it's America. Again, George Soros's name has appeared. There's really been, and I must say it, a despicable attack on a colleague and friend, a professor of political science, Filip Eidus, using anti-Semitic narrative, saying that he's received money from somewhere. This was just about 5 days ago. There was a strong reaction from the university, from colleagues, from NGOs. And the latest is 2 days ago, they've sent in the financial police into 4 civil society organizations that received money from USAID, strangely using the justification that because Trump and Vance have said that USAID is run by a bunch of radical lunatics, that this is a reason to go and check their money. Of course, those who know that most money by USAID was received by the government, by ministries, by the police, by everyone else. So again, this is classical intimidation techniques. And I think, and as we've seen from the beginning, anytime this kind of technique and violence has been used, it has only strengthened the determination of the movement.
Lura, of what Ivan just said, maybe now let's go a little bit to Georgia, because you just came back on Sunday, I think, so 2 days ago or 3 days ago. So maybe you can draw some parallels, or just tell us a little bit about what did you experience, what are similarities, because especially when it comes to this, blaming it on foreign powers, this is also what Georgian Dream has been doing, and they have also been quite violent against the protesters in Georgia, especially in Tbilisi. The difference, I would say, is that in Georgia it's quite centered on Tbilisi, right? But maybe I'll leave it to you, just give us some fresh memories of what you just have been experiencing, and maybe you can draw a parallel on what you see in the region.
Absolutely. I mean, first, I think the main commonality here with also what Ivan just said about the movements in Serbia is the aspect of agency, and the fact that the agency in this case really rests with the protesters. And I think it's very important to note that, for example, a lot of scholars like us and also policy analysts will say, the support that is needed from outside, but this does not in any way remove the agency from the protesters, and the fact that they really do see themselves as being, the actors of this change, of this democracy from below. And in this sense, I do believe that in this larger sense, this is and I liked what you said, the announcement of what is to come, because this is an announcement of what is to come. And one thing also connecting, you mentioned TikTok earlier, but if you get on TikTok, one of the things you will see is that a lot of people are seeing these as being a joint action, let's say, although it's not coordinated in any way, but they do see this as a part of a larger story of protecting certain values of democracy, of rule of law, of fair societies. And you see this across the board. I've seen TikTok posts, for example, connecting Germany, Slovakia, Georgia, Serbia. So there's an awareness that things are shifting, and there is a potential for things to be shifting. And we definitely need it, and not only in these countries that we're talking about. We need it in Germany, we need it in Austria. There is a need for this mobilization. There is a need for questioning the way that we've been doing things and rethinking the way we've been doing things. In the case of Georgia, this is sadly very urgent and very direct. And I was very inspired by the activists, because despite the violence that the regime has been unleashing on the activists, especially on the early days of the protest, they've been actively going out in the street. And now they've expanded beyond Tbilisi. You also have them in other cities, although there's challenges because generally there's been this focus on the capital, but I think the activists are becoming aware of this idea of it has to happen from the ground up. And the ground up is not just the capital, it's also the other regions of the country. But the regime in this case has been quite violent in the beginning. A lot of force was used against the activists. Still kidnappings happen to this day, whereby the regime, they saw that practicing violence out in the open did not scare activists. On the contrary, it made them more enraged. They want to go out in the street. So they've started doing this practice of kidnapping activists on the side streets, whereby their parents or colleagues are called after a few days or after a few hours saying, come and pick him up here. So I actually spoke to some activists who had gone through this, but I was inspired by the fact that this had not in any way discouraged the activists from going out in the street and protesting. On the contrary, now the regime has changed pace. It has decided to touch on the pockets of citizens, which also shows that they've introduced these huge fines on protesting on streets, on wearing masks so they could hide themselves, and all of these things, for example, with fines that are really disproportionate to the income of activists, of citizens, which also shows the arrogance of the regime, right? That, on one side it gives you a salary that is meager, on the other side it's happy to fine you for a sum that is, disproportionate to anything that you could make in a month or maybe even in a year. So in that sense, I think this also strengthens the idea that these regimes are unjust, they're unfair, they're arbitrary. So in this sense, whatever the regime does, if anything, strengthens the resolve of activists and of citizens. And in this sense, I think Georgia is an important country to follow. And also, sadly, it's being affected by things outside its power. So citizens in Georgia did not vote for Trump, yet they are affected by whatever Trump says. They did not vote for EU leaders, but they're affected by whatever leaders of EU countries do. So herein comes the responsibility that we say, for example, that EU should back up the activists or the civil society actors. It's exactly in the idea that very often it's these activists that perhaps believe in these normative values that the EU wants to espouse more than perhaps citizens in the EU, because they keep being challenged on these norms every day. And they know the value of concepts that perhaps here we take for granted. So in that sense, this is why we often call for EU countries, for institutions to back up the activists, because they are fighting for something that is truly essential to the European project at large. And I think I could see this in Georgia, we can see this in Serbia, and it is something that we need to pay attention to, and we absolutely must not undermine or undervalue, because if we do, I think we do so at our own peril, and I think that's important to note.
Yeah, Lura, you mentioned the European Union, and I would like to talk about the European Union as well. I mean, you said earlier even that Serbia is a candidate country. It even closed, I think, 2 chapters whenever that was many years ago, and we do know that there is not a real progress is not happening from the Serbian side, and we do also know that the whole enlargement process is in a very difficult situation from a European Union point of view. I mean, this is just where we are right now. However, a Serbian colleague recently asked me if we cannot do a podcast especially about the protests in Serbia and why the European Union is so silent. Because I do think, especially when it comes to Georgia, they have been quite vocal. The European Parliament has actually even written, how do you say it, a resolution on that they are not accepting that they expect new elections, that they are not accepting the election results, etc. I mean, this was all in the context of elections, what happened in Georgia, obviously. It's very different when it comes to Serbia, and I do agree that the European Union has been very silent, and even the Commissioner, Marta Kos, she recently, when was asked about this topic, she said, we are not interfering in domestic issues, more or less. I mean, this is just take a small citation out of it. How would you assess this divergence between Serbia, which is a lot closer to us and has a lot more, we do have a huge diaspora here of Serbs in Austria and in European countries still, and the contrary to Georgia, where we are very, very vocal. And I think geopolitics plays a role here.
Exactly. You've taken my punchline from the beginning. Indeed, we live in geopolitical times, in a huge geopolitical upheaval, even before Trump's election. And we mark this sad date of the 3rd anniversary of the Russian full-scale invasion and aggression of Ukraine, which has changed the whole landscape, not only the security, but every other aspect of it. War is back in Europe. Of course, we had the wars in my former country, Yugoslavia, but it was circumscribed, let's put it. But when a nuclear power attacks a very big European sovereign country like Ukraine, which had more than 40 million people, that is a game changer. And I think that the European Union, to speak collectively, for them, that was a wake-up call. That was a big, big wake-up call. Of course, the first one was the first invasion by Russia in 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. That helped Ukraine rearm itself in many ways, and I think that led to the fact that Russia was not able to capture the whole of Ukraine. But that meant that enlargement was back on the table to Ukraine, to Moldova, and to Georgia. Of course, they all became candidate countries. And Europe understood that really this is hard security now. I mean, there's values and all that, but we are somehow back to these brutal realities that the world is going back to old habits that we thought had been lost with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the famous end of history that, of course, never ended and will never end, because that is the way that we work. And that meant that the Western Balkans were back on the table of enlargement as well. And so these two things were being pushed, and it was a question of the credibility of the European Union. The last enlargement was Croatia in 2013, so this is now, 12 years? that we haven't had an enlargement, and the European Union understood that this credibility should be regained, and there was a return to more serious business of enlargement. And we have the hope now that countries like Montenegro, maybe Albania, maybe North Macedonia, I mean, let's be very hopeful here, could, in a respectable amount of time, by the end of this decade, be members or approach the door of the membership, to give credibility, on the one hand, back to the European Union, to strengthen its security, and to disallow the actions of Russia and China, not to mention Turkey or the Emirates, in this space of the Western Balkans, which I've called for a long time the inner courtyard of Europe. Now, of course, things don't always go as you want, because bigger things are happening, and Trump has arrived, and we're back to total transactionalism and deal-making, and values get lost. Somebody this morning, I was listening to British radio, said, yeah, it's Trump's values. It's not human rights. It's making a profit. That's his value. So we're really in a brutal world. And Europe, I think, is somehow caught off guard, even though totally conscious of the situation. How does it now change gears to more defense? Britain decided just yesterday to take away money from development aid and put it into defense aid. I mean, these are horribly difficult decisions, and yet Europe must act, because we don't know where Russia and Putin will be going. And so to come to Serbia specifically, and that's, I think, very important, many people don't understand the reason why the European Union is in this way hesitant. Marta Kos did write a letter. She demanded more media freedom, more rule of law. There was, I mean, some people back home call it weak, others say, well, that was the most she could do, but there was a response. The key reason is that President Vučić has been leaning totally westward by supplying artillery shells for Ukraine on a massive amount. Ukraine, without this Serbian help, which of course Serbia is selling these weapons, and then they are sent to Ukraine. He has a very close rapport with Zelensky. President Vučić sent his wife to Kiev 3 times. He's buying French fighter jets, probably buying a French nuclear power plant. France is building the Belgrade metro. France owns Belgrade airport for a certain amount of time. And then there's the famous lithium, which I simply call, we're going to save the German car industry by digging lithium in our country. Yeah. Of course, there are huge protests, and nobody really knows whether this lithium mine will go ahead. But he has bought the favors, or bought indulgences, to use religious language, and the West is very happy. So he is on the Western side in that regard. On the domestic front, it's what we've described. It's totally different. And so, to put it simply, I think the West doesn't want to lose him as a key contributor. You know, one American diplomat told me when asking about Serbia, said we have 3 priorities. This was a year ago: Ukraine, Ukraine, and Ukraine. So you can imagine what the Serbian military support means for the Western alliance before Trump's arrival. We'll see how that changes. Obviously, everyone is watching very carefully. There are other issues that are much bigger, and that's why I think the Western Balkans are a bit off the radar screen. And of course, let's remember that both Albania and Serbia have promised big real estate deals to President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. So there are many levels here to understand the hesitancy. But I think that, and to go back just for a moment to the protests of society led by students, is that no matter what happens, this is the beginning of the end of this regime. Now, will the end last 2 weeks, 2 months, or 2 years? Nobody can tell at this time, but we are going towards a change, and that is where the political translation of the movement is the big question that we're all asking ourselves.
Thanks, Ivan. I think that was very interesting and also very open, and I think it is something we need to understand, and the context is very different to Georgia, obviously. I mean, Georgia is neighboring Russia, and Russia actually has troops on the ground in Georgia in the two, let's say, regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which are not controlled by Georgia. And there is a huge difference also when it comes to the population, because the Georgian population is at least very, very much pro-European in the sense, and part of it is also because they want to go away from Russia and they want to be a little bit more independent, they want to have their sovereignty, and this is different for Serbia maybe generally. I'm happy if you would like to reflect on that as well, but I also would like to ask you maybe also, what was the reaction of the regional neighboring countries? You know, I mean, Kosovo, for obvious reasons, has been vocal and supportive of the protests, but I mean, there is also Bosnia-Herzegovina, they have said something, and there is also something going on there. So how important would you see, you know, the region itself and the support they are giving to the student protests here, if you would like to reflect on that as well?
Sure, I guess I would reflect more in the sense of the idea that a regime as strong as Vučić regime is being challenged is a message that reverberates beyond Serbia. And I think that is important. And what we do see in the region is that there is more of a shift. So you've always had protests. You have an active civil society in the region. But I think now the fact that there is a big movement in Serbia makes also the other protests gain some clarity, but also some power, let's say, because there's this idea of the citizens rising up, and the power of ideas, you know, is still powerful in that sense, even in the day of AI and technology. So in that sense, I think the idea, the fact that you have protests in Macedonia against, for example, traffic laws and the way that the rule of law works in the sense of protecting some rather than others, even when it causes death, against rising prices, against injustices in for example, against police, gender-based violence. You have a lot of feminist activists who have been protesting for years. All of this gives an idea that, you know, because we often think that people are becoming apathetic, people are drawing back from the Balkans, they want to move away from the Balkans. This is showing us that people are there, young people, but also other generations, because I think there is an intergenerational aspect to this. And it gives us hope in the idea that there is something that is brewing in the Western Balkans, and it's something democratic, and it's something grassroots. And I think we need to listen to that, and I think we need to fully support that. So I think that is quite kind of a powerful message to send forth. But I also think that we need to acknowledge the damage that has been done by all of this politics as crisis that has been happening in the Western Balkans for even since the fall of Yugoslavia. And I think there is also a sadness there in the sense that Ivan mentioned earlier, you know, the idea of normalcy. And for example, research in Serbia, even before the protest, was showing that, you know, most people, they just want a normal life. And in Kosovo, I was doing research with Gen Z, and I was asking them, you know, what is a good life for you? And it's very basic. It's, you know, really basic needs. Have healthcare, have a quality education, have good air, not die from air pollution. You know, and how sad is it that we've had governments that have made normal abnormal? And I think this is perhaps the greatest injustice of all in the Western Balkans, and this is something that we need to keep fixing, because it's important for people to feel that, you know, they have, and as they told me, that we can worry about normal things. And I, even from a personal note, for example, whenever I reflect, I'm from North Macedonia in Kosovo, I live here in Vienna, and, you know, people often ask me, like, why do you choose Vienna? And so often, it's, in the end of the day, it's not, you know, there's not big differences, but there is this idea of, I know what tomorrow will look like. You know, maybe not always now in Austria, but still there is an idea of normalcy of, you know where you stand. And the fact that we've taken this away, and I think these regimes, they thrive on this crisis. They thrive on the idea that you're unsure we need to give security back to the people, and not just security in the sense of the strong hard security, which is also necessary, but also security in the day-to-day life, in the sense that they feel safe, they feel cared for, and that is in the end what the state needs to do. So let's, I know it doesn't sound sexy, but let's bring normal back to the Western Balkans, I think would be a great way to start. And by radical means, I think it's the best way to get there.
Yeah. Thank you, Lura. Super good. Kind of already concluding, but I still have one extra question, which I think is very important as well. Because if we look at the societies in Serbia or also in the Western Balkans, but also in Georgia, it's still very patriarchal societies, right? But if you look at the protests and if you see it at the grassroots democracy and the people who are speaking up, it's also very, very female. So I just would like to ask you, maybe you can reflect a little bit on also the importance of, this gender issue, because I think this also gives an additional drive actually to make things more visible and also to show what we can do together, and that includes obviously also the gender aspects. And I just would be very, very interested in how you assess this, because I do know you have been working on this issue as well.
Yes, and I've been saying, even when there were no protests in Serbia, I was always saying that there's always activists present, because feminist activists have always been vocal against gender-based violence in all of these countries. And very many institutions and people consider gender-based violence as this isolated thing, but it's a challenge to a greater patriarchal structure whereby you're not providing safety. That's the bottom line. You're not giving safety to a significant part of your population, and that is the most blatant kind of show of lack of rule of law. Because if women don't feel safe within a society, and also with Gen Z, this is what I found, women don't feel safe. And what is more, the IT revolution has made this lack of safety become digital as well, because there's also digital violence. So in that sense, without challenging patriarchal structures, I think we cannot have democratic societies. Feminist activists have understood this for decades, and I think it's about time that institutions understood it too, that this is not a story about just protecting, although it's a powerful story to even say this is just about protecting a significant portion of society, but this is about creating ideas of safety and ideas of security within community, without which we cannot really have a blossoming democracy, because then you are disabled in the sense of when you don't have the security that the person next to you has, and you have more anxieties because you're a woman, that makes you participate less in other areas of your life. So it is such an unjust and unfair position to give women. And I think women have fought with this for decades, and it's about time we take it seriously. And fixing institutions, making them about rule of law, is fundamentally about giving this safety, about giving the idea that you are safe, institutions are here to protect you, and institutions are here to basically provide services to people. Otherwise, why have a state, right? So at least in my opinion. So in that sense, listen to the feminist activists is my last message, because they know where it's at.
Thank you so much, Lura. I still have one last question, which is about possible scenarios. So now going back to Serbia, what are the possible scenarios for you? How do you envisage now the next couple of months, maybe year? What are scenarios? What do you think? And maybe then following up on that still, the podcast is called Peace Matters. What would peace mean in this context for Serbia, maybe also for the region? So last question, scenarios, peace matters.
Well, let me start with that. I've been maintaining that we will not have war in the Balkans anymore, because unfortunately we did that in the 90s, and all of our societies have been depleted in so many social, economic, psychological, and other ways. And notwithstanding hot speeches by a variety of politicians about that, there is no energy in society for something like that. And so joining the European Union is joining the biggest peace project in modern history. And I think that's one of the key things, that why enlargement is, again, so important. And hopefully the European Union takes a lead on making geopolitical decisions on enlargement. As far as the scenarios are concerned, as I said a little earlier, I mean, in my book, the worst case scenario is that we do not have any change immediately in terms of political governance and regime. But if that is the case, we have a huge building block, very strong building block, which, as I said, shows a bright future for the society that will eventually burst politically out into the open in a year or two. Midterm, sort of mid-range scenario is that we will have some elections, but for that to happen, the electoral rules have to drastically change so that we have free and fair elections and we have an open media space, which means having a national frequency broadcaster that is independent of the regime. Those are two conditions that have been out there for years, demanded by the EU, by the US, but that have not been fulfilled because, in fact, you may remember December 23, we had stolen elections in Belgrade. And that led to a series of protests and quite critical reports by the various European organizations, ODIHR, European Parliament, Commission, etc. So that is the opposition disunited still, agreeing that the key demand of the students is their demand. We need to have full transparency on the tragedy that happened, meaning people need to be, 13 people have been indicted already. The general prosecutor is working, but not enough, frankly. And so the opposition will stand in that regard. The opposition's demand and some of the students' demand is to have a transitional government, an expert government, call it what you want, that would prepare the elections. The regime is completely against that because they know that that would be a beginning of the end. So we're in a kind of wait-and-see situation. I maintain that the students will not, as I said earlier, relent on that key demand. And the government has been giving drop by drop new documents that reveal, and somebody will have to fall. The government will have to, in spite of the loyalty that everyone professes that President Vučić has for all of his people, they have now begun an anti-corruption campaign. These are people whom we all knew were corrupt already 5 years ago. They are now being condemned. So they're putting on, they're doing their best as far as they are concerned, but people see through this. So they're buying time. It's a buying time operation. We'll probably have a new government with probably some new faces, again, under pressure. But this is only prolonging the fact that we will eventually have to come to election. What everyone agrees on, we don't want a violent change of regime, we want a peaceful, that's back to your fundamental peace question. That's how we threw Milosevic out, by peaceful electoral means, defended in the street, and so the same is here. I do not expect violence. Of course, I don't have a crystal ball. But I think that everyone will avoid that. Both the regime will use it, as we've seen up until now, but no arrests, no putting people in jail or sending them to Siberia.
Thank you. Lura, what would be your answer to the last
To peace
question?
matters?
Peace matters.
Well, I think I was just, the moment you asked that, I was thinking of my high school days because I used to have this backpack where I had embroidered the peace sign. Mm-hmm. So I've been, in a way, searching for peace ever since. But I think there's different levels to peace. So there's collective, there's also individual and personal, and that's what basically we've been talking about of the different levels, in the sense that there needs to be a state of affairs whereby you feel peace in a collective sense, but also peace in an individual sense, where you feel like you're free to pursue basically your full potential in a way. So for me, peace would be a way of peace from arbitrariness. So it's time to take the arbitrariness and these arbitrary regimes out of the equation and start working towards more just institutions, because I think without that, we don't have peace, whether it be personal, individual, or collective. And it's, I would just like to highlight how important it is to fight for both. Because very often, I think with the newer generations, there's also this idea of the individual because of the world space that has been created because of digital media. But it's also important, and I think the students in Serbia are showing this, the importance of fighting for both individual peace and freedom and for the collective. And in the Balkans, I think that is a very, very crucial message that we kind of have to carry across.
Thank you so much, Lura and Ivan. I think this was really inspiring. I didn't have such a nice discussion in a very long time because the situation in the world is not as rosy at the time. So this really was a beacon of hope. I mean, giving also a voice to the dissent, you know, of what is happening against authoritarianism, standing up together, having a grassroots movement without violence. So Thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I hope that we're going to have a good outcome, which is in line with all what you just have been saying. So thanks again, and yeah.
We hope so too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was episode 28 of Peace Matters. Please follow us on social media. I hope you found the discussion interesting and inspiring.